Pat. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Burnham, Housing Team Manager with New Narrative in Tigard. Also been doing this work for about 20 years. And yeah, as we've all talked about, we as facilitators, we're presenting, but we know there's a lot of expertise in this training and in this room. And so we'll appreciate learning and hearing from you all as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, folks. So we're going to launch in here, but we're going to start with just a little bit of a review of what we did on Monday, a very small review, but also provide you with the opportunity, if you thought about it over the course of the last 48 hours, and you had some questions you wanted to raise, want to give you time to ask those questions right now. So for those of you who were not here on Monday, we did a little start on, kind of getting us all on the same page, Homelessness 101. And then we talked about the impact of homelessness on people in terms of stress and trauma, and how to recognize that in your participants, as well as how to recognize it in yourself, because you have a very stressful job. And then we started to talk about how do we build the relationship and engagement with our participants, because everything about the work that we're doing depends on our ability to get that engagement and create that really solid relationship between ourselves and our participants, right? So did anybody have any questions they wanted to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're not comfortable speaking and you want to put it in the chat, that would be okay too.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Julie. I'm a member at North Star.
Hi, Julie.
And hi. Good morning. I was in on Monday, and I just had a question regarding the housing first.
Okay.
And do you have an idea of how prevalent that concept is across housing placement? And can you tell me which programs really prioritize that?
Sure. I might, if Alex is still here, I'll let him talk about it for your county, but I will tell you, it is considered an absolute national best practice. Anybody who gets funding from HUD or the VA is required to practice a housing first approach. And if you're interested in like research, or you want some, background on that, I'd be happy to. If you put your name and email address in the chat after we get done, I'll be glad to send you some resources on that. Alex, do you want to say anything about it for Washington County?
Other than from our perspective at the county, we want to ensure that our funding is not pays any additional barriers in front of participants moving into housing. We want to have a very robust housing first model. And we want to focus our attention on harm reduction procedures with our participants after they're in housing, instead of putting any barriers in advance. And that'll be very prevalent as well within the new RLRA vouchers, as low barriers we can get.
Does that help you, Julie?
Yes, thank you very much. And I put that email link in the chat for you.
Oh, okay. I'm going to write that down so I don't miss it. Got it. North Star OR. Okay. It's so funny. I keep seeing this OR and I keep thinking it's org. And you might even, I could do a test to see how many of you noticed that I messed up the email address for Washington County a few times by doing that. Thank you very much. Did anybody else have questions or want to put it in the chat? All right, then we will go ahead and move forward. So for today, somebody wants me to let them in. Okay, I let her in. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to be talking about how we assess the strengths and barriers of our participants. And this is different than the general assessment that we do when we enroll someone in the program. And I know that Washington County is rolling out a new assessment process, but for right now, there's been, a several page assessment that we do so that we know a lot about the participants, and of course, so that we get the data that we need to put in our favorite thing in the world, which is HMIS. But this is not that. This is an assessment that is, I find, very tried and true, and it's really just focusing on those things that we need to know about the person relative to helping them find housing and stabilizing in housing. Because there are a lot of things in our larger assessments that we may have to work on at some point. But if our work is really focused on that point of we want to help our folks stay housed, then this is going to help us really hone in on that. So that's what we're going to start with today. And then we're going to talk about how do we get ready for the search and identification of housing. And tomorrow we'll be going more into the how do you work with landlords and how do you find the housing and things like that. So let's see here. I think I'm turning this over to Pat now. So Pat, make sure you unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Good deal.
Okay, thank you, everyone. One of the first things you're going to be doing as housing navigators with your program participants are, and also along with one of the first things you'll be doing as you develop your relationship and start engaging your program participants is conducting housing barriers assessments. Next slide.
Oops, hold on a minute. Somebody keeps wanting to come in. There we go.
All right. So what do you need to know? I'm going to ask all of you, what do you need to know what do you think you need to know to assist participants to find housing and keeping their housing? So you can share your thoughts either verbally by unmuting yourself or in the chat. If anybody would like to share what you think you need to know to assist participants to find housing and keep their housing.
Oh, come on, you could do this. Part of us asking you questions is to keep this from getting really boring, listening to all of us, the three of us talk all the time.
Well, one of the things you need to know is you need to know information about them and what their situation is. You also need to know where the housing is located, what is available for them.
Right.
Very
Right.
true. There's some stuff in the chat. What is their current housing status?
Great.
Ask what their housing goals are is another thing from Yesenia.
Fabulous.
Obviously, their rental history, Hannah is sharing.
Great.
So
What
those
may-
are all great examples. Anybody else?
Maybe what they feel their barriers have been in the past to stay housed.
Absolutely. Great answer.
And we have Carrie, who's a pretty gifted housing
Whoa.
navigator already. Shared something in the chat, but I lost it. But basically a
Barriers.
list of some of the obvious things you need to know as a housing navigator. Physical and mental health barriers also shared.
That was a
Thanks
great answer.
for all your input. Those are all, here's another one from Anthony at Home Plate. My team has said that it would be helpful to understand. Things are flipping too quick for me to read them.
I'm sorry, I must have done that to you, Pat. So it
Yeah.
says, my team has said that it would be helpful to understand what documents and requirements exist for new housing opportunities before they roll out. Great point.
Great
We
point.
try to
Yeah.
keep you guys posted and understanding all these processes, but sometimes they roll out faster than we can even keep track of.
But all those are excellent things that you would obviously need to know as a housing navigator, and you'd want to work with your clients on what are the communication barriers, phone, email, location, also a good point. Can we go to the next slide? So basically, when we're assessing people, we're just conducting an evaluation mainly of their circumstances. And so obviously, even though the definition of assessment is to judge or value, obviously we're not judging people and we're not assessing the character of folks. So when we use terms like assessment, this is what is immediately brought to mind. We must be mindful of our own headspace as we start working with people and start hearing their history. They might have some of their own responses when they start sharing their history with you that comes up. So we need to do a lot of self-care and keep ourselves in check when we start hearing things so that we avoid getting into a judgmental space with our program participants. Next slide. So assessments are critical, but they need to be limited to the client's relevant history, current plans and desires. So assessments are only meant to identify housing barriers and help you know how to assist your program participant. But assessments can never be used to do things like determine that the client's not a good fit for a program or something like that. So you don't want a housing barriers assessment to result in a refusal of assistance. Additionally, assessments enable you to match clients' tenant screening barriers that we'll be talking about later with landlords that might be willing to work with those tenant screening barriers. And assessments should, a final point would be that assessments should never be used to determine how much financial assistance to offer or how long services will last. That comes later. All you're doing is you're like Sherlock Holmes at the bottom of the screen here. You're trying to evaluate what the situation looks like, and you're on a fact-finding mission along with your program participant. Next slide. So when you think of housing barriers, what comes to mind? What are some of the things that come to mind for you guys in the audience when you think of housing barriers?
Evictions.
Mm-hmm.
Employment can be whether or not a person's employed or has income.
Lack of rental history.
Yeah.
Criminal history types things, rental history.
These are great. Arson conviction.
All of these things are housing barriers and obvious housing barriers. And then many of you that have been doing this work for some time have worked with program participants that have multiple barriers.
Right.
So basically, there are two categories of housing barriers that are important when we're discussing practicing rapid rehousing of literally homeless folks. First one we call tenant screening barriers because they correspond to criteria that many landlords use to decide whom to select as a tenant. So these days, it's very easy to access public data on a person, and landlords routinely do this, or it's a common practice. And there are a number of businesses that will do this for landlords online. So many of these barriers are related to poverty, such as income, credit history, whether or not your program participant has a history of paying the rent on time, etc. And the great majority of rapid rehousing program participants have at least some of these tenant screening barriers. Some barriers that concern landlords are ones that relate to potential trouble for the landlord. For instance, damage to a rental unit. Does the person have a criminal history? And do they have a history of conflict with previous landlords or even their neighbors in their previous tenancies? So some of our clients have either one of these things, or they might have all of these things. You never know until you conduct your assessment. Second thing that we're going to talk about are housing retention barriers that are distinctly different than tenant screening barriers. So also the thing to remember about housing retention barriers is that it's a little bit tricky to identify what's a housing retention barrier and what isn't. So housing retention barriers primarily are housing issues that have caused problems in the past. And the key word is that they have reoccurred, so that the program participant has done something behaviorally or something similar to that repeatedly in their units, like not paying the rent repeatedly. So for instance, what is not a housing retention barrier would be a situation where a low-income person, say, had a health issue come up in their family and it compromised their ability to pay the rent. And that was a one-time situation or an isolated incident, but the person lost their housing. We wouldn't consider that a housing retention barrier. So the key word with housing retention barriers are things that keep coming up. So like, has a person been evicted 3 times? Has a person got a history of having issues with landlords or being at odds with landlords or their neighbors? These are the types of things that we're identifying as housing retention barriers. Basically an issue that might reoccur, but we'll be talking more about those in a few minutes. So I wanted to stop right here real quick because when we're going through tenant screening barriers or we're talking about housing retention barriers with our program participants, we're dredging up a lot of stuff history-wise for folks, and it brings up a lot of emotional responses. It's important that we remind ourselves, like you were learning in the first training on Monday, that engagement is an ongoing process, and it starts on day 1 and it continues, and sometimes it continues beyond program exit, especially if you're tracking housing retention after people leave rent assistance programs. It can also be strengthened or weakened depending on trust and style each day. So like every day is a new day when you're working with people, and some days you might backslide in your relationship with them. But if you remember that every day is a new day, you can gain engagement at some later point. Anytime you want to hit the reset button, re-engagement can occur. So we don't ever want to give up or become frustrated. Engagement also depends on life experiences, stress levels, and personality of the client. So a lot of the folks we're working with are really in a bad space. They've been told no repeatedly for a long period of time. And so we're also taking them through a journey through all of that one more time. And so this can cause a lot of potential friction. So there can be conflicts as a result of going through this with folks. So it's part of the housing navigator or case manager's job to cultivate and maintain engagement, and it's going to be challenging. So just remember, when people are under severe stress, they're in less control of their emotions. They may overreact, especially with fear or anger. And it's your job to anticipate this and be prepared to react helpfully rather than contributing to escalating the problem. So when you, the case manager, are under stress yourself, it's also harder for you to deal helpfully with clients. So remember, self-care is very, very important when you're doing this work. We can't help anybody else unless we're healthy ourselves. So next slide. So landlords screen because the information is available and because it's the only way they know how to avoid loss of rent, property damage, or conflict with other tenants, in trouble with the police. So it's not illogical to think that there's a chance that prior bad behavior is going to repeat itself. Landlords also know that someone with a clean record can also be a huge problem. So there's no guarantee that just because somebody comes up with a clean screening, that they're going to be a good tenant. So landlords taking a gamble no matter what. The point here is that they will want to work. You can make the point that by having you available as an advocate for this tenant that you're working with, or prospective tenant that you're working with, who has a poor history, they're actually getting a better deal because they have you as an advocate, and you'd be the go-to person or problem solver should anything come up. So what they don't have with somebody that might become a problem tenant that doesn't have an advocate is nobody to go to. And they have to try and figure out how to deal with these things themselves. And some landlords aren't very good at that. You know, it's basically about the bottom line. So over time, as this team, huge team we're going to have in Washington County of housing navigators starts making and building relationships with various landlords, we'll be able to develop a pool of landlords that will start overlooking tenant screening barriers just because they know having that housing navigators and case managers are going to be part of the deal if they choose to rent to a prospective tenant that you're bringing before them. Next slide.
Oop, there we go.
So what are you going to assess? Tenant screening barriers are those elements of a person's history that would cause a landlord to reject their application. So landlords are going to find these barriers. So you need to find them first, basically. So you need to find them first so you can make a better case for each rapid rehousing program participant. So what do you assess? You assess the same things a landlord looks for to make a rental decision. So go ahead and hit the button. Income and employment. Is their income adequate? Is it reliable? Can they pay the rent on time every month? Or because they're in the program, will they be able to pay the rent on time? Credit history. Has the tenant accumulated unpaid debts, especially debts to previous landlords? Or is their debt so high that they may not be able to pay the rent? Criminal history is another factor, especially crimes related to drugs is huge, or crimes against other persons like assault and things of that nature. This is going to be a huge issue for landlords, especially around drugs, where laws or ordinances can levy incredible punishments against landlords if their tenants or even guests of their tenants manufacture or sell drugs. Sometimes where there's been, say, manufacturing going on in a unit, landlords are faced with the cost of remediation of that unit, and that's can run into thousands of dollars. Past housing history is another issue that's going to come up and that landlords are going to look at. It's obviously going to be relevant to landlords. Does the person have a record of evictions, lease violations, late rent payments, damage, conflict that disrupts the neighborhood or the community or the building? Landlord references are another key thing. When you're talking to previous landlords, would they rent to this person again? This is always important to screening criteria. If a previous landlord says, no, I wouldn't rent, there's going to be a problem with a future prospective landlord. So knowing, the more you know and the more you bring to a prospective landlord that you already know, the better off the situation is going to be. So how to assess tenant screening barriers. First thing you can do is you can buy a tenant screening report of your own from many. There are a lot of different online companies. I believe Department of Housing Services is going to have a collaborative contract with Pacific Screening Company. Pacific Screening Company is the primary provider background screenings that landlords use in Washington County. And I think in the metro area, there are others, but Pacific is one of the primary ones. And it just makes sense to use the same company that landlords use in this area. And it's by far the easiest method, and many funding sources that you might be working with as far as rent assistance funds or other funds that you've been granted or your agency has been granted. Check your program manuals, because it could be an allowable expense under the program you're using to serve your participant with. So an example of that is the Supportive Services for Veterans Families program, where purchasing an advanced copy of a tenant screening is an allowable expense in that program. Landlords definitely could get into a space as you all go out into the community to wind up accepting these tenant screening reports without charging an application fee, because the work has already been done. And the only reason they're allowed to charge an application fee in the first place is because they're going to pay Pacific Screening or some other company to do this work. So if you've done it in advance, we might help train, for lack of a better way of putting it, landlords to waive application fees if they know that you've already done this. You can hit the rest of it. So in contrast, if you don't buy a report, you'll have to wind up doing the work all yourself, because you're going to want to have all this information before the landlord gets it. So, and because landlords do not like it if they feel like you're not disclosing things, or the prospective applicant is not disclosing things. So we need to be very upfront with what's in a person's history. So if you don't buy the screening report, you got to do it yourself. And that involves talking to your client about their income, housing, and criminal history, which you're already doing. And do your online search of their public eviction and criminal history. That's accessible to anybody. It's a matter of public record. Clients can do that on their own, but you can also do that on behalf of your client. And finally, you can call previous landlords basically within the window of the last 3 to 5 years. Anything beyond 5 years is really less relevant than what's happened in the last 3 to 5 years. So go ahead to the next slide. This is an example of a tenant screening report. They're going to look different, but it's primarily they're looking at what the tenants or prospective tenants' credit score is, whether they have bankruptcies, whether they owe money, whether things are in collections, whether they've owe money to previous landlords. Next slide. This is a continuation of that. There's a question from somebody in the chat about whether I was mentioning veterans can get, yeah, what I was mentioning was that in the SSVF program, purchasing tenant screening reports is an allowable expense. And so basically I was mentioning to check your program manuals, depending on the source of rent assistance you're using, to see whether that's an allowable expense. So why assess tenant screening barriers? Your research is going to help you match the tenant with the landlord that will accept that person's profile and history. And it's also a way that over time you'll start developing, getting to know landlords and getting to know what their limits are. And so you'll be able to more efficiently connect your program participants with landlords depending on their screening history. And there'll be a pool of landlords that'll accept A history as compared to a landlord's accept a B type of history. So also it's important that you understand your program participants' tenant screening barriers to help you identify what types of incentives you might want to offer to landlords. Because if you know what all these barriers are beforehand, before you even walk into the rental office, you can be prepared to assume that maybe I'm going to have to offer this landlord double damage deposit to soften them up a little bit. Or you might want to offer more frequent check-ins. Some standards across the country suggest that being available 24/7 is a good practice in housing navigation. I don't know too many that are doing that right now, but I believe Jeff might have in the past. And then if a person appears to be too risky for a landlord's case, maybe offering a backup of loss mitigation or risk mitigation. If the tenant has housing retention barriers that have to do with damage to previous units, and the landlord's skeptical because of that, it could be that if you guarantee that you'll cover the cost of any damages incurred by your program participant, a landlord might soften up in that regard. So basically, landlords just don't want to lose money, and if we can help them feel confident that they won't, to the extent that that's possible, then that's what we're trying to do at this stage. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Jeff. He'll be talking to you about housing retention barriers in more detail.
Before we move forward, did anybody want to ask any other questions of Pat?
There's a lot of folks asking if we'll be sending out slides.
Yes, and I've put that in that we are going to send them out after Friday, after we finish the whole set of 4 sessions. Thanks for asking.
Then
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So one thing I'm just gonna say is when we come to it, sometimes I'm having trouble keeping up with the chat, so I may.
I'll do that for you. Don't worry
Awesome.
about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about housing retention barriers, and I think it's one thing that we often say is that it's one thing to get housing, it's another to keep it. And I think in our relationships with landlords and establishing that, like, we realize that their goal is to have long-term tenants who are not causing any problems or issues in the community, and from our perspective too, we want residents not only to acquire housing, which I think is oftentimes seen as like the primary goal, but really the real work starts in providing the support services for people once they acquire housing, and then providing that support on an ongoing basis so that they keep housing and thrive in their home. So the tenant screening barriers that Pat was talking about are relatively easy to identify. A screening report from any screening company will list the issues that landlords use to screen out prospective tenants. And that's the list that we all have to work with. Although we need to be aware that sometimes those reports do have errors, especially if the subject has a common name. Recently saw that with somebody who there was an eviction showing up on somebody's record out in a coastal town, and the household had never lived in that area. So housing retention barriers, on the other hand, are much more nuanced. They are issues that have caused housing crises in the past and could reoccur in new housing. This is the area where we have to be really careful not to project our own views, our own biases, about the reasons people in general lose their housing. So housing retention barriers are the reasons this person has actually experienced housing crises in the past, and we have to tread lightly. So one thing about housing barriers is, or housing retention barriers, these are really, like Pat referenced earlier, these are reoccurring patterns in a person's history that have resulted in a housing crisis. So you're not looking for a few mishaps, you're looking at patterns of behavior. Some people just genuinely, repeatedly have bad luck that could have, that couldn't have been foreseen or prevented, and those are not considered housing retention barriers. So I think Pat may have referenced earlier, somebody like if they had a job loss or had to go into a hospital and lost their income or were unable to continue to pay for their rent, that's more of a mishap or an unfortunate situation, not a housing retention barrier. However, perhaps those situations where substance abuse issues or having unauthorized guests in a person's record are they could also be issues where a person is not so familiar with like the clauses in a lease that allow a landlord to evict a person who's disturbing the peace by failing to control guests, noise, children, trash, etc. All this time, an individual may be thinking that a landlord may be acting illegally toward them and had no right to kick the person out. So, but there are patterns that can be remedied and will be unlikely to occur once the person has more information, more skills, a better way of communicating with the landlord, and a strategy for keeping problematic friends or guests out of the building. So what do you assess? So we're assessing patterns of behavior. Housing retention barriers can be a slippery slope. It can be easy to imagine a scenario where anything in your client's life could conceivably be considered as a potential cause for housing instability at some point in the future. But that's not what we're looking for here. Housing retention barriers are the patterns that have actually led to housing instability in the past, not characteristics or situations that you think may cause the person to lose their housing in the future. So if we can take, for example, a person who, as an example, somebody who may drink a 6-pack of beer every day or every night. And the question is drinking a barrier to stable housing? Let's say he lost his job when the company downsized and he's 57 years old. Other companies wouldn't hire him and he ended up homeless. But he has good landlord references and no evictions. Is his 6-pack drinking a housing retention barrier? In this case, it wouldn't really appear to be so. So we have to be careful not to consider everything that could possibly logically cost somebody his or her housing as a housing retention barrier. So yeah, we often, again, coming from the harm reduction model that Alex referenced earlier, yeah, we all work with people that are probably actively using illegal or legal substances, and that may or may not be an actual housing barrier for them, or retention barrier. So this individual may actually need to be carefully budgeting so you can afford beer and still pay the rent. But it doesn't seem like the beer itself has ever caused the problem. On the other hand, you can consider somebody who may drink socially with friends and often has a group of friends visit who also use alcohol or other drugs. And as a result, 3 landlords have evicted that person for having people over and causing maybe noise disturbances. And in this case, the individual's drug use is definitely a housing retention barrier. While it's true that a person's mental health or substance abuse can be a housing retention barrier, most people with these diagnoses do remain housed. So it's important not to look just for the presence of personal problems, but really look for these established patterns in a person's history that have resulted in housing instability or involuntary housing loss. Only when a personal issue has directly caused housing loss or severe housing instability does it reach the level of a housing retention barrier. For example, a person who is living with mental illness, I mean, we work with many people who live with mental health issues, and you know, in some cases we've seen people who do have patterns of, like, once they are doing well, they get into housing, feeling good, they may choose to go off of medications, and we've seen some people who do have a pattern of that, and then that results in housing instability or loss of housing.
So Jeff, I'm going to interrupt for a quick second because we've got some good conversations going on in the chat here.
Okay.
So Carrie brought up that domestic violence can play a big role in housing retention, especially if they're still with the abusive partner or the partner's coming around and going back and forth. And that's really true. And one of the things that we want to make sure that everybody who's doing, you know, housing retention work knows about is how to help people make safety plans, and also how to make really solid referrals to domestic violence providers. And Alex S. Was talking about, he likes to go over an example lease with somebody so that they better understand the lease and the expectations and their rights and things like that, as a way to help clear up what is discrimination, what's legal, what's not, that kind of thing. And Carrie said, yeah, that she really likes to do that as well. Like, she likes to be at the lease signing so that when some landlords will actually go through the lease line by line, and she likes to be there to make sure that if there's questions or make room for the tenant to ask questions, that we can do that. So nice work. And also Carrie mentioned that during retention, she'll refer back to the different things in the lease as a way to keep that lease sort of forefront in the person's mind. And Alex responded to that and said that he also does that. So those are some really great things. Thanks, you guys. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. And I think too, sometimes when we know landlords, if we're accompanying somebody to a lease signing, or even if you're not familiar with you're just getting to know the landlord, I think there have been times where I think we've seen people, the housing navigators, kind of really like preemptively work with a landlord to make sure that they really take time going through the lease with the individual, because sometimes people will just be like rushing through, sign here. And I think oftentimes we try to get people to like just slow it down and make sure everything's covered.
Yeah, that's great.
And that the person that we're with can ask a lot of questions. So yeah, thanks for bringing those up. So if you find a pattern in the screening barrier assessment, like several evictions, now you need to dig a little bit deeper. Like, why did this occur? Is there a pattern within the pattern? Were all the evictions due to a misunderstanding of the lease requirements, like moving a boyfriend or girlfriend into the apartment without landlord permission? Maybe the problem was constant conflict with other tenants or with the landlord. We would ask, what were the circumstances of the conflicts, and how did the person behave in those situations? So We also want to know, or if this is like, if there is no pattern except bad luck and poverty. Take, for example, a person with 3 evictions, all due to failure to pay the rent, but each situation was very different, such as like a layoff, an illness in the family, or an unexpected or expensive car repair, not things that you could have easily prevented. So we can't do our work as case managers or housing case managers to minimize the risk of future housing instability if we don't know the most likely cause or causes of past instability. So we'll really need to do some, we really do need to do some detective work, and keep in mind that many people have no real housing retention barriers beyond poverty, other than failing to pay the rent due to financial crises. They are average or better tenants with average or better references. You will need to know your housing or your client's housing retention barriers to know if there are issues you will want to help them address to prevent reoccurrence in the future. I always hate these caution signs. No, I'm just kidding. So a person may have, so it might be easy to assume that a person's drinking or diagnosis of a disability is always a housing retention barrier. So in the first example, a person with schizophrenia who hides in her room with the lights out for 2 days when voices occurred does not have necessarily a housing barrier. But so what would you do if you were to assist a person who turns up the stereo whenever he or she hears voices, in order to, what would you do to help somebody to keep housing if you were working with a person who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, who hears voices, but in order to deal with those voices, turns the TV up at full volume? Headphones, I
Renee.
see.
Oh, good. You see that you're looking at the chat. Great job, Jeff. Headphones, great idea. Any other ideas? Oh, we're going to have a run on headphones. Wouldn't that be a fun thing to be able to get a donation to your agency, so you just had them ready?
Yeah, and I think headphones is one of the things that is often suggested. I think also kind of looking at different types of opportunities where somebody could live, where maybe they're not so close to neighbors, or in a rental property where maybe we're more familiar with that property, and the volume of the television may not be such an issue in that community. So but those are great ideas.
Sarah says, you mentioned earlier about evaluating medications, whether they are on them or not. What are some other alternatives? Med management, if available. Yep, absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you, guys. So I think yep, go ahead, Jeff.
So again, finding housing retention barriers is not a reason to screen a person out of the program, but what you can do, I guess we have to ask, what can we do with this information? First, it may affect the housing search itself. If the person has decided to quit, for example, having friends over to party, which is something that repeatedly cost them their housing, maybe they could look for housing further away from those friends, in another location, in Tigard instead of Hillsborough, or perhaps in a secure building, so those friends can't easily access their individual unit without invitation. And if a person tends to get into arguments with other tenants about their noise and their children, maybe she would prefer housing with older, quieter tenants. We see that quite a bit with folks, even looking at some of the 55 and older, 65, 62 and older properties within the community. On the other hand, if your client is the noisy problem tenant, a building for older, quiet tenants who might complain to the landlord would probably be a bad choice. So really, we're working with folks to really kind of, yeah, just identify what's going to be. I know some people don't like the term. I think it's old school, but I still use it. But like, what's going to be a good fit for the individual and what type of community, housing or rental community they're looking for. You can also look for issues that a case manager could help the tenant to address to prevent another housing problem. Maybe you found a pattern that seems due to lack of understanding of lease requirements, or a pattern of bad behavior by guests, or lack of communication skills when dealing with landlords. These could reoccur and jeopardize housing again. Our job as housing case managers is to help our clients minimize those risks by learning new information, setting boundaries with certain people in their lives, and practicing new ways of communicating with their landlord. This is an important role for case managers. Housing retention is as important as signing a lease and getting the key to a new apartment. Actually, I would say even more so. And remember that you are not trying to solve every life problem the person may seem to have. You're really focusing on housing, and you're trying to prevent a potentially predictable reoccurrence of homelessness. And if the person has no housing retention barriers beyond poverty, you may come up with some strategies that could help with budgeting, spending, etc., which is a subject for another webinar session that we have. So.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. Does anybody have any questions for Jeff before we do a little activity?
If somebody experiences identity theft, would that be indirect or direct a barrier to getting?
Well, yeah, and you know how long it might take for that to be resolved, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, and hopefully you know a good legal services organization that could help with that. And you know, sometimes, and I think we're going to talk about this either later today or tomorrow, I can't remember. How do you help the tenant explain some of these things to a landlord, right? So
Yeah.
we'll come to that. Great question.
Thanks.
So what I want to do now is just sort of demonstrate some of the kind of information that we might get and help you see the difference between the tenant screening barriers and the housing retention barriers. So we're going to start with talking about Robert. And first, what I'm going to show you are the things that, as a case manager, the case manager learns just through the interview with Robert, okay? So here are the things that the case manager gleans. So let's see. So Robert's 38, a single adult. He's in a shelter and he's got poor hygiene and his eye contact was really minimal when he was talking to me, and he asked me to repeat most of my questions. So when I asked him about his housing history, he said, I complained to the city about the last 4 apartments and then the landlords kicked me out. Okay. When I asked about his income or whether he had been employed, he says he gets a lot of contractor jobs in the parking lot of Home Depot. And he said, when I work, I make really good money, but I haven't worked since I ended up in the shelter because I really can't sleep and I can't keep clean and there's no buses. And if you all could mute yourself, if you're not speaking, that would be awesome. And then in terms of criminal history, he said he doesn't have any, none, no criminal history. And on his credit, he says, when I have money, I pay. When I don't have money, I don't pay. Well, there you go. That's about as simple as it gets, right? Pretty straightforward. So I'm going to ask you, when you just look at this, based on this interview, what do you think are some of his possible tenant screening barriers? Not housing retention barriers, but tenant screening barriers. Feel free to unmute yourself and answer, or put it in the chat. This is where you talk now. Need some help? You could
He
do
might
this.
not pay his rent on time.
Right. So being late on his rent would be a tenant screening barrier. Absolutely. And let's see, we've got in the chat, rental history, landlord references. Yep. Not being, maybe not being comfortable talking to people might affect the interview with the landlord. Possibly has formal evictions. Yep. Given that he complained about landlord.
Unstable employment history.
Yeah, unstable income. Yeah, absolutely. Proving his income. That's a really good point. I once worked with somebody who it took me 5 tries to get him stably housed. I helped him find housing 4 times, and he came back and back and back. And after he was out of the 4th place, he came back and said he'd found another place. And I said, well, how are you gonna afford it? And he said, well, I make about $500 a month returning returnable bottles and cans. And I said, wow, that's really great. Do you have any way to verify that? And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. I've got every receipt I've ever gotten from cashing in those bottles and cans. And I said, all right, let's go talk to the landlord. And, we did. And he showed the landlord all this stuff. And the landlord was so impressed by that he's like, yeah, I got you. Come on in here. And that was the last place he had moved out of. So, don't be surprised by what kinds of things people might be able to do to prove their income. And you can use bank account statements to help prove the income sometime too, Carrie says. Good point. Anybody else? Any other screening barriers? The complaining about the landlord may also be a screening barrier because he's going to get really bad references, right? So we want to think about that. All right, so here we go. Complaining about the landlords. So other landlords may fear that he'd get them in trouble. You talked about the income, and his credit history is probably poor because he doesn't pay his bills. So what do you think his possible housing retention barriers would be? Anybody?
Well, paying the rent on time is going to be a barrier if he doesn't
Yeah.
have the money all the time. It's coming and going.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Carrie says maybe mental health support. Landlord relations. Yes, you bet. That's a good one. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to throw these up here for you. So you talked about conflict with the landlord. Good one. Income not being steady, so may not be able to pay that rent every month. So here's the next thing I want to do. I want to show you what the tenant screening report on Robert does. Because when I used to do this work, I would always start with my own interview, right? And it wasn't really like a checklist and an interview, just a conversation, as part of that building that relationship. And then with his permission, I would get the tenant screening report and then I'd go over it with him, right? So here's what the tenant screening report showed. 5 evictions in the past 2 years for lease violations. And one landlord said that Robert had visitors who sold drugs. None would rent to him again. None of the landlords would rent to him again. Okay, so the next one is employment. Impossible to verify because he works for cash. One employer, though, said that Robert was a really excellent worker, but that his friends would show up at work and that was a big problem. But the employer said he'd hire him again if he could get on top of those friends. And in terms of criminal history, he has no convictions, but he was arrested twice for possession and intent to distribute drugs. Now, that's a really significant fine point, right? The difference between the arrests and convictions. To us, it's super important, right? But to landlords, if the arrests show up on the background, most landlords, unless they're more enlightened and thoughtful, and maybe we could help them understand that, they do care about the arrests as well as the convictions. And his credit history was actually fair. A few unpaid debts, but no arrears to any of those landlords. So that's really interesting that there's evictions, but he never owed a landlord money. So even though the landlord said they would never rent to him again, you might be able to get a landlord to at least verify that he never owed them any money and he paid his rent. So that's our job, right? Getting deep under that stuff. So now, what do you think his tenant screening barriers are? Anything different than what you said before? So 5 evictions, right? That's a lot. And Carrie's saying they do not count, arrests do not count. And it's true, it totally goes against fair housing, absolutely. But it is something that, you know, like everything else in the world, so does race discrimination and gender discrimination. It doesn't mean that people don't make those decisions that way without ever saying it, right? So we do have to think about that. So negative landlord references, and landlords often will take those references seriously. Unverified employment or income. So one of the things would be to work with Robert to see if he could go back to his employer and ask them, could they give some kind of reference for him about being a good employee and that he worked for him off and on for X number of, period of time. Arrest for possession. It's critical whether it was Robert who was dealing or his friends. But as Carrie says, that she encourages people to push back if this happens. And it's absolutely true. Because one of the things we're going to talk about, I think Jeff is going to talk about this, is how do we help people prepare to explain things in their background, right? And this is one of those things like, hey man, I was not the one. And so then the landlord might say, well, what are you going to do about keeping your friends out? And he might have a good, by working with you, you might have a really good way to answer that question. So what about housing retention barriers? Anything different based on that report? Well, this whole thing about his friends, right? So that's a serious and a very difficult housing retention barrier, right? Sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's family members, and helping somebody to try to learn how to manage that can be a very difficult situation. And I wonder if any of you have done that before and what your way of dealing with that is. Does anybody have any tips on how you help someone deal with problematic friends or family? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share.
I have a situation where I haven't been in housing for a while, but I had some friends that were looking for apartments and stuff. But I had a situation where I was helping one particular person, but another guy that's in this housing unit is very needy. And this person that I was trying to help his name is John. He would not do anything for himself, but the other person, Ray, wanted to have this friend, so he would do everything that he could to help the situation. So enabling each other didn't help anything, and one was afraid to lose the other. So if you have friends like Robert and his friends, and the drugs, unless that situation gets controlled, like you said, if he manages it and gets out of that drug, that relationship, you're always going to have that as a possibility as Robert goes up and down as far as his circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to run back to the people that his friends, you know, he wants them. So he's going to go ahead and go back there. And then you set up different enabling situations where, you know, one of them had to actually get away from a doctor, as it turned out, to try to get back on track with his own program.
Mm.
So friends and relatives can have a really, really strong pull on them. And then you throw in miscellaneous circumstances and it's like a free for all.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. It's a really good point. And so this is, I think it was Jeff was saying that when you learn about this before you start looking for a place to live, then you can talk about it in the context of, well, is there a place, you know, would you like to find a place that's nowhere near where your friend is, right? Would that be helpful to you? So helping them by offering ideas, like it's going to have to come from them, obviously. But, you know, sometimes it's just really, I mean, I'm sure we all have these circumstances where we can't figure out like what the heck to do about something. And when it's something as deep and personal as friends or family, that can be a real, you know, trigger for people. So thinking about, well, would you like to live in another part of town? Or what about a building where people have to ring, you know, a buzzer to get to you, or even a building that has someone at the front door all the time? Or, you know, I've even had case managers tell me that they've offered to be the bad guy and have the conversation with the friend and just talk about the consequences that their behavior is having on Robert, and, you know, why Robert wants to do that. Of course, doing it together, but, you know, helping Robert, you know, if he's having trouble making that explanation. And Carrie's got a great entry about this in here. So y'all should read the chat box. I won't read her whole thing. So she's talking about doing it before moving into housing. And that's really the key if you find out about it. That's why we want to find out about these things, so that we could try to address them before we get in. And then they become a part of your housing plan, your housing stability plan as well, right? Because, you know, we don't just talk about something once. You notice that we haven't talked about anything once on these slides. Like we keep repeating ourselves, right? Because as adults, it takes us a little bit of repetition to learn. So, you know, also on his episodic income, you know, he said part of the reason he hasn't worked much is because he's in the shelter. And, you know, that's not an illegitimate comment, right? And some shelters won't let you leave and come back during the day, or if he works weird hours, whatever. So again, talking about that and helping Robert to think about how to save his money, not like maybe not in a savings account, but is there a way, you know, the envelope model, take your money and put some in an envelope labeled rent, and one labeled utilities, and one labeled food, and one labeled whatever you want, right? And divide up as you bring in money, put them in those envelopes. We have to help people learn those tricks of the trade, right? But they may also teach you. Actually, one of my clients taught me the envelope model. So not having a car and relying on good public transportation to get to work is also something you really want to think about before you move somebody in, right? So it's important to think and address and ask questions about, so if you're going to go to work and you want to find a job, how are you going to get there? So do we need to be on a bus line? And maybe somebody's always had a car and thinks the only way to get there is a car. We may need to help them learn what the bus route is, right? And think about and learn about that. Actually, this is really convenient, and I can get you some bus passes, and we can get you a low income bus pass. And, you know, it's really not as bad as you might think if, you know, people who have cars are used to having cars. So thanks. This was all good stuff that you all put in there. Thank you so much. So, you know, we're comparing these two, and we've talked about that. But one of the questions I want to ask you is, why do you think there was a difference between what Robert told me during our first discussion about this and then the report? What could cause that? Anybody?
He doesn't have a relationship with you yet.
Exactly, Kim. Thank you. Yeah. Yep. We like, I think about somebody starting to ask me all these questions, and I'm like, I don't know that I need to tell you that. Like, tell you about my badass friends, right? Like, I don't know what you're going to do with that information. And if you think about it in the context of our homeless work, right? As Pat said early on in this, people are used to being told no or being told they can't be helped because of things in their background. And so we have to, again, he talked about that engagement. We really have to work it and work it and work it so that they feel they can trust us. But that's also a reason why getting a report can be so helpful. And then proving to Robert that even though those really kind of some of those things showed up in his background report, we're not going anywhere. We're going to help you figure out how to get into housing in spite of them, right? So if they've been turned down because of criminal record, or because they've had a lot of evictions, they may be afraid to tell you because you're going to say the same thing that the landlords did, right? And they may also conceal information that, you know, shows they need some help with something that you're not going to give them. You know, that level of trust just gets really deep, right? The other piece, though, is really important to remember, and we talked about this on Monday, is the impact of that stress on somebody makes our memories a little bit fuzzy. And so, you know, he may have forgotten that at that moment, not permanently forgotten, but at the moment of being interviewed by you and being nervous about it and being worried you're not going to help him and all of that, that there's actually evictions on his record, right? Or it may be that the information on the record is inaccurate. And Pat or Jeff talked about that, or Jeff talked about how, you know, identity theft kinds of things, but also just mistakes on the record. And especially if there's like juvenile record issues that were supposed to be expunged, sometimes they're not expunged, right? And other kinds of things like that. And that's also incredibly valuable because then we can help them connect to legal services or a credit counseling group to help fix those issues, right? So that we can be doing that at the same time that we're helping them find the housing, okay? So just to go through this a little bit to, you know, sort of wrap this part up, we really want to use these assessments to help us find the housing, right? We need to match the landlords, what they like and what they'll accept and what they won't accept with the person's background. So I'm sure you all know people who don't care about somebody's eviction history if it's 1 or 2 evictions in the last 10 years. You know, they're willing to excuse that. I bet you even know people who would take somebody with criminal background if it's older than, say, 5 years, right? Or it's certain kinds of criminal background. So we want to be able to do that matching, not that we're picking the unit, but we're helping our participant learn that, well, here, these are 3 landlords that I think you have a good chance with, right? And then it helps us create that housing stability plan. I've said that a couple of times, and it'll help you think about in advance, if these things reoccur, how you're going to resolve the problems with the landlords, okay? So it's just really an effective way to start out your process of looking for housing. So in terms of the summary, I think we've sort of bashed this into your head pretty well today. Tenant screening barriers are the ones that the landlord finds out about, and the housing retention barriers are the things that are going to be a pattern that are going to be a challenge in the future, right? So really great. And Carrie, you know, we're just going to put you on here and let you lead this whole session because you're just putting it all in the chat. So thank you so much for doing
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
that. So this is in here for you. When you get the slides, there'll be a little checklist for you as something to think about and to, you know, jog your memory. Don't be sorry, Carrie. Don't be sorry. We're always happy to have people add. And it's affirming, right? For all of us. So thanks for doing that. All right. Questions about this? Okay. I think Pat's going to take over. I'm going to just do a little check with everybody. This is the last session. We may have to go a little bit quickly, Pat and Jeff, just because we're a little bit behind on the timing, I think. Okay.
All
All right, Pat, up to you.
Now we're going to move into a little bit on housing search and identification. So what do we need to know before we help somebody look for housing? Or when we're looking for housing, what are the things that we're going to look at if we're looking for housing on our own? So what you see here are some of the things we need to learn from folks as we're going about helping them find housing. Gently inquiring about these needs are an important first step before you have them apply for units. So it's important to note that you should not be applying or helping assist program participants apply for housing that they will have no hope of ever being able to afford. So we don't want to set people up to fail. Moving forward on the next slide. It's important to get to know your participant before you start having the what do you want in housing conversation with them. Talk with them about their past housing experiences, which is what you're kind of doing as you're going through screening, tenant screening barriers and housing retention barriers, assessing for those things. But it's also a part of a conversation, and we want to glean from the program participant what those previous experiences were like for them personally. Where was the last place they lived? What did they like about it? What they did to make it work? What was hard about it? What was hard about living there? Or was there something that happened that made it unsuccessful? And if so, what do we need to know about that time to prevent that unsuccessful thing, the thing that felt unsuccessful, from happening again? So, you know, while you're talking with them, just think about tenant screening barriers and housing retention barriers if you're going through this. So next slide. Where do you find units? I'm sure everybody has a lot to add to the chat about where to find units. There are a lot of various ways of doing that. Craigslist is one of them. Social media is another. You're going to be looking at things like unit size, density. Is it a 4-story complex, or are they all ground floor or somewhere in between? Do they all have dishwashers or washers and dryers? Some do, some don't. Typically, most places have dishwashers these days, but what type of special accommodations might your tenant need? You know, do they need a ground floor unit or accessibility in a unit? These are things that are important. I actually had a situation where a housing navigator placed somebody in a wheelchair in a new housing unit, and we were celebrating this until we discovered that the unit was so remote that there was no transportation for this person to get things he needed. So he's in a wheelchair kind of a mile from any store, you know, so that really wasn't a good plan. So going over these things with your client is pretty important. So I'll turn it over to Jeff now.
I like to steal things from Rentwell. So I don't know how, I mean, I assume many people here are familiar with Rentwell. If not, it's something worth, it's a tenant education course that is really fantastic, and there's opportunities to attend or facilitate. And so borrowing from Rentwell, I personally like this term of housing portfolio. So when we're working with individuals who are in the process of like putting together their plan and compiling everything in preparation for their housing search, we help them create a housing portfolio, which consists of, and this isn't listed here, but really their housing plan, which is, we call it, it's a kind of a formalized, we'd use a formalized plan that includes everything from the person's preferences, needs for like any kind of accommodations, like upstairs or downstairs units, preferences being like location where they'd want to live, looking at what their strengths are, both in terms of related to housing in the past or moving forward. So, you know, have a fixed income, always pay my portion of rent on time, things like that, to even the things that they enjoy doing, like meaningful activities for them, like hobbies or things that they like to do out in the community. So really focusing on preferences, strengths. We help them to identify their support team members, including the housing case manager, peer support specialist, housing navigator, family members, anybody who might be part of their support team. And then I'm kind of like in a twisted way, my favorite part, probably Carrie's as well, is to really kind of dig into the barriers that person is facing. We've talked a lot about that, and then really focusing on how to like utilize their preferences, strengths, and their support team to overcome the barriers. So with all that said, that's like a beginning piece for putting together, compiling, helping them to compile a housing portfolio. So that would also consist of the housing cover letter, which Carrie Williams would also refer to as personal statement. Some people might call it a reasonable accommodation letter, if that's applicable. Everything from master application, copy of IDs, housing search tracking forms, things to really contemplate that are important is like looking at that support team that the person identifies, and then identifying folks that would be able to provide them with a housing reference letter and compiling those. Professional letters being, or letters from professionals being probably carrying much more weight, but also that could be personal references. And one of the things that our reentry housing team includes is a reasonable accommodation form that's available through Multifamily Northwest. I'm sure Carrie could actually share that if she hasn't already. It's good because in the event that you would want that the person would be requesting a reasonable accommodation, this allows a medical provider or somebody qualified to actually like help the person sign off on a submission for a request for an accommodation. I'll talk really quickly about that. I know we don't have a lot of time. But with all of this, really what we're doing is helping the person put together anything that's going to help them make the case for housing with a landlord. And I will say that in our programs, as probably is true with most of your alls, most people who are living in an apartment now were first initially denied at that apartment complex. So the housing portfolio is something that can carry weight, be submitted if the landlord is willing to accept it at the time of application submittal. And it can be used to appeal a denial or if you were going for an appeal based on fair housing and somebody's disability, it could be used for a reasonable accommodation request. So we can look at this as being a really significant part of the housing planning and preparation process. And as it says, you know, on the left-hand side of this slide, it does help the individual really understand the processes, their strengths, the challenges to getting housing, and to really build a strong case for themselves to make a case in the event that their application is denied, to have that denial overturned. One thing I didn't mention that's on here is certificates of completion. So anything that shows somebody's progress. So let's say somebody had, y'all may be familiar with this, but let's say a landlord is requiring that, or their screening criteria says no evictions in the last 3 years, and somebody has an eviction from a year and a half ago, and at that time they were like using illegal substances and they're suffering with addiction issues, and then have since gone through treatment, graduated treatment program. These documents can therefore then be used to show, like, the person who says, yes, I did these things in the past. I was evicted because of these challenges I had, but now I've been clean and sober for the last year. I've been graduated from this program, and these things can be used to help overturn a denial. So the housing, I can't stress enough the importance of the housing portfolio.
You know, I just want to say that what I really love about this is how it helps you to explain that this is tough for everybody. You know, like finding housing right now, unless you're an incredibly wealthy person, is difficult everywhere. And so, you know, helping them to learn the skill of explaining or documenting why they would be a good client, a good tenant, it's even great prep for, you know, job interviews and things like that. So, you know, I really love this. And I have a 27-year-old daughter, but the first time she was living in New York and the first time she rented on her own in New York, I gave her this idea and said, I want you to put this together, because she was an apprentice teacher. So in New York, they generally want between 8 and 10 times the rent in your income. And there was no way that was going to happen. Now, she was living with 5 other people, but even still, none of them had that kind of income. And the landlord was blown away by it, literally blown away, like, oh my God, you're so organized. This is like, okay, yeah, okay, I trust you. You're going to be all right. You're a teacher. Whoa, yeah. So I think it's a terrific, I think it's just a really great tool. Thanks.
Yeah. And that being said, I also want to say, like, it's sometimes challenging when, you know, somebody does have something that you think might qualify as covered under fair housing for a reasonable accommodation request. And like in the example I was giving, where somebody said, like, maybe they were using illegal substances, were evicted, maybe they even graduated a treatment program, but now are using again. In those cases, you know, I think any one of us could probably help them write a reasonable accommodation. But in those cases where it's truly not, you know, developing that housing portfolio, going through this process with them really gets them to look at like what steps they might want to take and the choices that are available to them if they want to maybe like re-engage in some sort of recovery program or something. And also to help guide us and know, you know, like, instead of a stronger reasonable accommodation type of appeal, you're really just working with that person to do a straight appeal, which is going to be like much more of like really selling yourself to the landlord, but not having any fair housing protection behind you. And so it's,
You know, I
again,
think
it's a useful tool.
this sounds like a really super topic to do like a quick kind of learning community on perhaps in the future, where we could really dig into the whole portfolio idea and reasonable accommodation. So I'm making a note of that, Jeff. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I think I'm probably off topic, but that's my plug. That's where that leads.
All right.
Yeah, so preparing for viewing units, or we the goal is to help people understand their strengths and challenges in getting housing. It's important that I think we all take the time to not only ourselves, but encourage people to really like review screening criteria for any apartment complex that they're going to apply to. Just because they're not meeting that requirement. So again, if you have a criminal conviction from 3 years ago and it's a felony conviction and the landlord says no felonies in the past 7 years, it does not mean that that person could not eventually get approved for that apartment. So I think the person would have to make some informed choices on whether to apply there and look at the strength of their housing portfolio or any sort of appeal packet that they might have. So it's just important to like be able to discuss for us to be able to discuss with the individual, or really encourage the individual when they're out looking or with us talking to a landlord to become comfortable in talking about the screening criteria that the landlord has, and being able to, if they're willing to really open up and share a bit about their story and the challenges they're facing in terms of housing barriers, because that can go a long way. We just had somebody recently approved for housing, and he actually did it on his own with his support team member, a family member, where he went up, he was denied for an apartment, but because he had been really upfront with them, he submitted a letter appealing the decision and had a family member write a letter, and he was approved. And we were all prepared to help him with letters, but he never even needed our support because he was so honest and open with the landlord. So just preparing people, and sometimes those are very tough conversations. Like we worked with a woman who had she had a sex conviction. She was would be considered a registered sex offender. And opening up and sharing information, like looking at the screening criteria and then deciding which landlords and when to share information was so painful for her. It was traumatizing. So I think being able to like, this is that part about our relationship with people as well, is being able to like connect with them so that they can even be discussing these types of issues with us, and then preparing them to be able to like look at screening criteria and then talk to landlords about what their past is.
Okay. We're going to have to keep moving.
You put on there to go with people. I think we can't emphasize the importance of that enough. Or we call it housing exploration, where we hop in a car, for example, and cruise around to different parts of the Washington County that the person wants to look for housing in, and even the places that they see that they don't want to live in, or the landlords that they don't want to rent from, is just super helpful. So, and the other part about that is it gives you a lot of time to continue to develop that trust and that relationship with the individual. So, again, comparing the person for being denied, it's not everybody that we work with gets denied outright when they first submit an application, but it does happen quite frequently. Again, preparing people for that appeal process is super important, but it's also just to remember and be realistic with people and remind them that sometimes there's a lot of competition out there. It's like a lot of the housing is based on first come, first served basis. You could be the first one to talk to the landlord, get your application ready, but somebody else comes in later and gets their application and the screening fee submitted before the individual. And so those things happen. Yeah, we do see people who maybe are shooting really high as far as the choices they're making and where they prefer to live. And sometimes we do see people kind of come down as far as their expectations and where they would want to live. And I think it is important. These are learning opportunities for us to reflect with the individual. So even if like an appeal or reasonable accommodation is denied, this is an opportunity for us to like work with the individual and sit down with them and kind of look at reshape the approach, or maybe look at like even tightening up the housing portfolio, adding some new information or getting new references or something. And it is a difficult balance. I often say that sometimes I feel like I'm there to offer hope to people, and I feel like by being realistic about in walking through the process with people, sometimes I feel like we're actually like also taking hope away and then offering it. And it's a hard process. And I think that again, that's where that relationship is super important, and being realistic about things and working really hard with the person. Once housing is secured, of course, like huge deal, huge accomplishment, and definitely time to throw high fives. Well, I don't know if we can do that anymore, but in the day, throw high fives and celebrate with the person. Yeah, if we, as much as possible, being with that person, walking through the process with them to, as Carrie mentioned, I think before, go to lease signing with them, help them through the transition, acquiring furniture, making sure that everything is submitted properly with the housing authority, if they have a rent assistance, that their utilities are set up, and anything else that's needed, including preparation for any like familiarization with the community, like where to go get food, where to making sure that their addresses change, mailing addresses change, things like that.
So this is just the reminder.
Yeah.
Of
So
all the
housing
things we talked
checklist.
about. Questions, folks?
I don't have a question, but the previous one about the denial and how to make the next approach, maintaining motivation. I think, again, like I said Monday, that our attitude and our demeanor has to be positive and uplifting for them, because if they've already been denied once and you made an appeal and denied again, this is like pretty soon they're going to say, why bother?
Right.
I can't find a place, and they'll give up their hope. So they need to grab a hold of our hope so that we can keep going with them. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you, Robin. I love
Actually,
that.
I'm Lori, but
Oh, Lori, well, thank you.
we're both here, but I'm not.
I
on
only
there.
know what I could see.
I know.
You're both there. Good
We're
job.
both here.
All right. Anybody else? Questions or comments? All right. We're going to wrap this up really quickly now. So, the overview is that we have talked about how to prep your participant for the search and how to do the tenant, the tenant screening assessment and the housing retention barriers. We talked about putting together a housing portfolio, but between what Jeff said and what Carrie was putting in the chat, I just feel like we're going to do a separate session on that. Why not? That's such a great tool. And, really putting the focus on putting their best foot forward. And I guess I would add to this summary what Lori said, which is, this is when it really is on us, right? If you remember back to what we talked about on Monday about the impact of stress and trauma on people's brains, this is where we're going to help them. Jeff talks about walking alongside people. Pat talks about being their support. Lori mentioned being their hope, letting them grab onto our hope. You may be burned out and you may be tired and you may be as disappointed as they are, but we have to keep going. Like, we have to help them stay positive and motivated, not deny that it isn't disappointing to get turned down, but just to be able to move forward from that disappointment. So really important. And you guys have put a lot of great stuff into the chat. So our next session is going to be really focused on the landlords. Okay, and Carrie and I were sort of chatting back and forth about landlords. And one of the things that I like to say is that we have two clients. We have the participant, our tenant, and we have the landlord as one of our clients as well. So we're going to really focus on that and engaging with landlords. How do you do that? And we're going to talk about how do those landlord and tenancy supports, how do they work both ways? So we're supporting the tenant by being successful in the housing. That does a lot for the landlord as well. So that's what the next session tomorrow is going to be about. Don't go away yet, because there's some more info here. There's some upcoming training opportunities, and they are happening. Oh, I should have put these in chronological order. August 3rd is going to be a session on substance use disorders 101. August 6th, there's going to be a session on suicide prevention. And September 1st, there's going to be one on culturally specific trauma-informed care. So these are all super opportunities being offered to you by the Washington, I live in Washtenaw County, Washington County Department of Housing Services. And the other thing is, I would like you to take 1 minute right now, don't hang up, please stay with me, copy this link, put it in your browser, and just take this survey. It literally has 5 questions on it, just so that we can make sure we're doing the best for you. And if there's some things that you still have questions about, that's the last question, you'll be able to let us know so that we can plan for that for Thursday and Friday, okay? So just, I'm gonna give you 1 minute, I'm gonna time it to just copy this link, stick it in your browser. You should get the Washington County Housing Navigation Survey Day 2. And if it doesn't work, let me know. Oh, Sarah, I wish we had CEUs. We will work on that for the future. I'll make a note of that. Thank you so much. Put it in the chat for you? Sure, I can do that. Hold on. Whoops. Maybe I can't. Hold on. Let me go backwards. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. I'm going to grab this document. Hi, everybody. Now I see you. It's awesome. Let me just find this. Okay, here we go. Hold on. I'm going to grab it. No, I can't grab it. I don't know why I can't grab it. So let me go back and going back. Come on, previous. Okay, I'm going to put it in the chat right this way. Here we go. Sorry, everybody. I'm not as savvy at this stuff as you guys are probably.
Somebody put it in the chat already.
Oh, geez. Thank you. Here it is again. Good job. Thank you for doing that, whoever did that for me. All right. So I am going to ask you the last question, which is, if you feel like it and you feel moved, if you could share a new insight that you gained from today's session in the chat before you head on out, we would love that. Thank you, Rebecca or Hannah. Thank you, Hannah, for putting it in. Yeah, the upcoming trainings have been sent out to everybody already, but they'll also be right in here. So when you get the PowerPoint on Friday, you'll have the links to those places, to those registrations. Oh, that's great, Nicole. You hadn't, it didn't occur to you to try to get the application fees waived. You know, it's one of those things that the first time you do it with a landlord, they may go, oh no, forget it. But if you get that relationship, and you know, once you get that relationship with a landlord, sometimes we're able to get them to commit. Like, how about if you give me your next 5 openings and I'll get them, you know, I'll get them filled for you. And then you're at that place where they'll go, yeah, and you just turn over this this screening report and we won't charge you. Is it $25 in your community?
75,
75, seriously?
or that's an application fee.
But that's what they
I don't-
use it
I don't know
for.
what it costs to actually get the report ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's the application. $50 at least, Carrie says. Yeah, well, here it's only 25, but in New York it's 100. I
Do
know.
they still have that website that it was like a no app fee website, and you paid a one-time fee to all these different property management?
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Huh, I don't know about that. Anybody know about that? One App Oregon? Oh, there it is.
Something like that.
Allie
No app
just,
fee.
Allie just put it in the chat. One App Oregon. I'm going to look that up.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah. Thanks, Allie. No.
Well, you know, when you really start getting good at this landlord engagement stuff and you start doing it more as a system and less as each agency's out on their own, one of the things that some communities have been able to do is actually get a whole series of landlords to agree to one application, including the housing authority. And then, you know, you get it's so much easier because you just fill it all out and everybody's there. It's great.
Yeah.
I also want to make the point that there is going to be, in effect, a gang or army of housing navigators saturating the market that has never been there before, as a result of the work that's being done in Washington County right now, starting with this training. So over time, landlords are going to become more accustomed to working with this uniform approach to housing navigation that we're kind of putting forward here. The other thing I want to add is I think has been mentioned before, there are 2 trainings going on at once, kind of. The collective experience you guys all bring to the table is huge. So not only do we have this PowerPoint training that we're presenting to you guys, but there's a separate training going on in the chat throughout this training. And I want to thank Carrie especially, and anybody else who's provided input, because those are nuances that we're not able to cover in the training that are also very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ideas that Alex is bringing forward that we're probably going to institute once this training's done and the case management boot camp is done is he's talking about having regular what I've called and what he calls learning communities. So like do it through office hours, perhaps, where, you know, once a week or once every 2 weeks, we can all get on and share ideas, share resources, you know, maybe even try to do a little case conferencing, you know, try to get some help from ideas from each other. And, you know, ultimately, that's what really matters, is hearing from other people that are doing this. And we're going to talk a bit about the saturation also on Friday, because this is a crazy time. I mean, not only are all of you going to be out there, but all those housing vouchers are out there, and then the other vouchers. And, you know, this is you know, it's so trite now to say these are unprecedented times, but to me, this is like the definition of unprecedented times. So, okay, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Please take the survey and have a good rest of your day. Thanks to Jeff and to Pat it's great to have partners like them here that know the local fauna.
Hey, Julie, are we staying on at all?
Would you like to chat?
Yeah, for a bit.
Okay, let's let everybody get off and
Thank-
then we could do that.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm going to run and just get a glass of water before we go.
Me too. Really? Hey, that's good. Thanks for the feedback. Oh, shoot. I'm just not really going out. Oh, good. Okay. Thanks, Heidi. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, okay, cool. So weird sometimes. Gotta follow on or not.
I think Pat.
We lost Pat, huh?
Yeah, well, he'll get back, I'm sure.
I saw him dash out.
Well,
He left it on, but
I know. Well, he might be coming back.
yeah.
So how did you feel? Better today?
I felt better today.
Did you?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, you seem just as great as yesterday, but it matters how you feel about it.
Yeah. So actually, I was curious what you think. I think it's just, yeah. Or
Well,
thoughts or.
I think, you know, I think we got some good interaction going, you know, not terrific interaction. It's just so hard. People are so zoomed out by now that I don't take that too personally. I'm gonna take a look at the, maybe I could pull it up right now. The survey.
Sorry, real quickly, who's that behind you?
Oh, that's Buster. Buster, say hi. It's
Hey,
hard to see
Buster.
him because he's all black.
Yeah, I just kind of saw him.
I know. He's a giant Schnauzer standard poodle.
Wow, nice.
Yeah,
I
he's.
wonder if that's really long legs.
Yes, really long
Oh.
legs. Yeah. So you've seen a giant Schnauzer before. Pam.
I'm thinking maybe because Sabrina, my wife's cousin, has a dog. I can't really tell without a stand-up, but yeah, it's like I think maybe the same kind of dog, and they're
Oh, interesting.
beautiful.
Well, it's an interesting combo because, you know, poodles, they're super smart.
Mhm.
And Schnauzers are too, but they're also super, what's the word? Stubborn.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. So let's see if we got any responses to our survey. I'm gonna look this up. What'd you think about it?
I thought the interaction, you know, I mean, I know I saw Heidi respond to something, and Carrie's part of our team. She's definitely all over that chat. I'm looking at it now. It's cool. And she does add like all those pieces.
I do think it would be good to do a 1-hour session on portfolios and reasonable accommodations. I think that, you know, that's a real fine point of the work that a lot of people just don't even know about.
Yeah, and you know, I think. Sorry, I didn't really even. And oh,
I know you
first of all,
were totally ignoring me. It's
I
okay.
couldn't see it. I didn't see it because I didn't pull the chat up like that.
Oh, okay.
Because I was afraid that if so this is the technophobe that I am. I didn't hit the little check. I didn't hit the chat thing. I could see them pop up, but I did not hit the chat thing because I didn't want it to like take it away from like move me out of where I couldn't see the
Oh,
PowerPoint.
yeah, well, that's a
So-
problem. I understand that. Well, then next time, maybe I'll text you.
Yeah, and actually, well, my phone's. So the other part is though, we were scheduled till 11:30.
Yeah, I know, but I got overly nervous.
Okay.
That's my bad.
Yeah, and I probably, even if I'm like, I'm still gonna get these points in.
I
I
know you
really
are.
didn't.
Listen, Jeff, I appreciate that because you had
Yeah.
stuff that you felt was important to say. And even though I'm pushing you, I'm glad you did it.
Yeah, and I appreciate too that you were when you said, these are good points, and it wasn't until afterwards I'm like, oh, Julie told me to knock it out, like time out, and I'm like, what time was that? And I'm like, oh, it was. But I didn't see that till after. But I do think it's such like I think ultimately that along with the relationships is the key. Landlord, I mean all of it's the key, but
Yeah.
appealing and reasonable accommodations and understand I didn't know about it. Landlords, I mean, there were some staff members when I moved here that taught me about it, but then really the landlords taught me about it.
Yeah. Cool.
Anyway, it's pretty interesting. I thought yeah, I thought it was good overall.
Well, we got 17 people filled it out. So that's about half,
Okay.
which that's pretty good because you hope for 20%. So half is good. I'm learning these things. So how would you rate day 2 of the training overall? 65% excellent, 35% good. That's all. That's good. Was the training relevant to my work? It was 65% strongly agree, 17%, 18% agree, somewhat agree, 6% neither disagree or agree, 5%. So that's like one person.
One person said no.
One person said neither agree nor
Oh.
disagree. Another one person said somewhat disagree, and that's it.
Okay.
I increased or enhanced my understanding of housing navigation work. We got 41% strongly agree and 41% agree. So that's great.
What was the percentage that agreed?
Same amount, 41 and
41?
41. Yeah, so 82% either agreed or strongly agreed. That's great, really great.
Yeah.
How would you rate our knowledge? We got 41% said excellent and 53% said very good. So there you go, we're smart. How would you rate the training experience? Oh, we're using go to training. Everybody said I was comfortable and able to learn and participate, 88%. One person said, I understand the need and could learn this way, though it's not optimal. And one person said it was okay. And then what topics would you like more information about? So the answers are, 4 people said working with participants' barriers to housing. 4 people said housing search and ID. 3 people said how to approach landlords. 3 people said case management for housing stability. 2 said supporting landlord retention. 1 said none of the above, and nobody said added anything. So that's those are great. That's great feedback. That's super great.
Yeah. And I'm sorry on that last one. I don't know if you already clicked out of it, but
No.
barrier, the things that people were interested in
Well, the
expanding on.
highest 2 4s were the things we talked about today. Working with participants' barriers and housing search and ID.
And those were what percentage? Sorry, our number.
24%, which is
Between the
just
two.
4 people.
Oh, okay.
4 people each for those 2.
Okay, gotcha. I think those are,
That's the stuff that gives everybody agita. So like, the more you do it, the better you get, right? And so if you're one of the new people, this wasn't enough.
yeah. And the barrier thing, it goes I mean, again, it goes to like what Carrie's detailing in the chat. I mean, to like the an assessment to really like, yeah, I think that's cool.
Yeah,
That's cool.
I'll print this up as soon as I can figure, I may not be able to print it up, but I'll see, because I have the cheap version of SurveyMonkey. In other
Okay.
words, the free one.
Cool. Yeah. That's cool though. That's one yeah, that's good. All right. Well, how do you feel about all that?
Oh, hey, Pat, you're back. How do you feel?
Hey,
About the, what?
About the
just
whole thing.
transpired? Yeah, I thought it went pretty well.
Pretty well?
A lot more, I don't have a frame of reference because, or I'm not able to compare it to Monday. But it seemed like there was good participation from the attendees.
Mm-hmm.
And we had some feedback that was pretty positive too. People are getting something out of it, so we're not just performing for blank stares, I guess.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. And we were just going over the results from the survey. So half of the folks took the survey, which is good because you go for 20%.
Oh,
I know
I
that
had
seems,
no idea.
well, there's people who make a study
Yeah.
out of this. And I'm working with a group at UCLA in another project that I have, and they're teaching me all this. You know, they like do all this survey research and
Right.
stuff like that. And they told me, yeah, if you get 20%, that's good.
So what does the survey reveal?
So we had 6 questions. How would you rate the training overall, just for today? And everybody, 18 people now have answered. Everybody answered either excellent or good. So 60% excellent and 40% good. And then the training was relevant to my work. A little over 60% said strongly agree, and a little over 20% said agree. And then there was like one person each who said some would agree, neither agree, or disagree.
Uh-huh.
And then I increased or enhanced my understanding of housing navigation. It's about 39% said strongly agree, about 43% said agree. How would you rate the trainer's knowledge of the subject? Almost 40% said excellent, and about 55% said very good.
no, that
Oh,
one
that's not
person
bad at
changed
all.
it. Okay.
And
The
then
numbers have changed.
how would you rate the experience of doing, this is a dumb one, about doing it this way through the GoToMeeting? And the majority of people said I was comfortable. 1 or 2 people said, I understand the need, but it's not the best way. Somebody said it was okay. And then the last one was, what topics would you like more information about? And the 2 biggest were working with participants' barriers and housing search and identification. And then those were both about 25%. And then the next 2 biggest was how to approach landlords and case management for stability.
Yeah.
So it's good. It's good. It's good.
Yeah, that
So I'll
was good.
send this to you.
Thank you.
Interesting results.
Yeah,
on
I
that
think
survey.
so.
I think there is likely quite a mix of different backgrounds and beliefs around homelessness in the group,
Uh-huh.
not necessarily social service oriented, more some mix of faith-based folks in there. And that can bring a mishmash of belief about homelessness.
Mm-hmm. What did you think about that question about housing first? Was that from somebody who was from one of those groups?
I'm assuming I'm making an assumption, so.
Her
that's-
name, she was from North Star. Is that a substance abuse treatment center?
I'm not quite familiar with North Star.
It's a peer-run program in Portland, actually. I invited Liz to join. I know they're out in Multnomah County, but she was asking, we're actually going to meet with her because they recently had a kind of like an accreditation type
Oh, it's
review
a
or something.
clubhouse.
And there was a need for them to increase their housing presence or
Oh.
something, or the services. So
Okay.
I went ahead and invited her, and I think
That's great.
that's where that came from.
So you think that's maybe the first time she's heard it?
I think-
About
I
housing
don't know.
first?
I don't know the person who asked the question, but yeah, I think they're trying to become, this is kind of a new area for them to really kind of just around housing. And I think Will, my boss and I are meeting with them on Friday.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I think it is a new area.
So it's a clubhouse.
Yeah, it's the clubhouse model, the old school
Yeah.
clubhouse models
Yeah.
for mental health.
Well, there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah,
We still have one here too.
I like them.
Okay.
I like the peer-based programs. I shouldn't say it's peer-run, I guess but it's rooted very much peer-based.
Right, yeah. Cool. All right. Well, we okay? We good?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you all.
Great going, team. Tell Carrie, thank you for all her
Oh, yeah.
help. I said before you got back, Pat, that what I said on the Zoom, I think is really true. I think it would be great to have Carrie and Jeff or somebody do like a 1 hour. Oh, who's that?
It's my daughter.
Hey.
Hi.
We have we have a cold or a bug going through the house. So
Oh, no.
we're having deficits in childcare and mommy.
Oh, wow. Oh, I hope it stays as just a cold.
Yeah. Well, testing happened.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Okay. So what were you saying again about
Oh,
Carrie?
that doing like a 1 hour session, like a learning opportunity for people on doing the portfolio and the reasonable accommodation work. I
Yeah.
think it's such a fine point. I think that would be a great like 1 hour session or maybe an hour and a half session that,
Yeah, I
whoever
agree.
wants to come and get that would be good. So I made a note of that.
And Carrie and I talk a lot about it, but there are other experts as well. So Pat's team, that's what they do. We all
Okay,
do this
that's
kind of
great.
stuff. So
Well, maybe you guys, I'll just turn you loose and tell you guys to create it. It's not up to me. Oh, look at that cutie. How old is she?
What this? No. Okay.
She's got
Scrambling
a
to
sense
figure
of
out what the
humor,
baby's
doesn't
are.
she?
Can you guys translate for me?
she
What's
said,
that?
give me that.
There we go.
What'd you get, a cookie?
Yeah. No,
Ooh.
cracker.
Cracker, okay, good cracker. All right, guys, thanks a million.
Yeah, same to you.
I think we've
Thank you.
also figured out how to make the whole thing work in terms of the technology, so maybe tomorrow will be easier.
Yeah, that was great. I thought you did a
All
great
right.
job yesterday. It's like what you had told me on the way in. You said something's going to go wrong with technology. I think you said that. And
Yeah,
Always
it
happens.
always does.
always happens.
Yep. All right, guys. Have a
Thank
good
you.
weekend if I don't talk. Oh, I'll see you tomorrow. What am I talking about? Okay.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm
It's
gonna
not
see you in
Friday.
2 more days.
It feels
Bye.
like Friday.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Pat.